The air in courtroom 3B was a stagnant cocktail of cheap bleach, old paper, and the faint metallic tang of human despair. It was a place where futures were unwritten and rewritten in thick black ink, where the weight of the law was a physical pressure that bowed shoulders and hollowed eyes. Dust motes, ancient and indifferent, danced in the weak shafts of sunlight that pierced the grimy windows, illuminating a world rendered in shades of beige and mahogany. The low, constant hum of the overhead fluorescent lights was the room's only pulse, a monotonous drone that vibrated in the bones and frayed the nerves. At the center of this universe of consequence sat Judge Marcus Thorne, a man whose presence was as solid and imposing as the marble edifice of the courthouse itself. He was a monument to his own authority, draped in robes so black they seemed to drink the very light from the room. His face was a mask of stern jurisprudence, all sharp angles and severe lines, his silver hair combed back with a precision that bordered on aggression. His voice, when he spoke, was not merely a sound, but an event, a resonant boom that commanded silence and obedience. It was a voice that had shattered arguments, cowed defendants, and sealed fates for 2 decades. Ego filled the space around him, a tangible aura of self-importance that left little room for doubt and even less for mercy. Across from this bastion of judicial might at the defendant's table sat a man who was his complete antithesis. Elias Thorne, Marcus's younger brother, was a ghost, haunting the edges of the room. He was gaunt, his cheeks sunken, his skin possessing the pale, waxy sheen of long-term neglect. His clothes, a threadbare hoodie and worn jeans, hung from his skeletal frame like a tattered flag on a forgotten pole. His hair was a matted, unkempt mess, and his eyes, though shadowed by exhaustion and addiction, held a strange and unnerving stillness. They were deep-set pools of startling intelligence, absorbing every detail of the room with a quiet, analytical calm that was profoundly out of place. He did not fidget. He did not slump. He sat with an unnatural straightness, a silent, unwavering pillar of endurance in the face of his own public ruin. He was the quiet at the heart of the storm. The charge was possession with intent to manufacture. The evidence laid out on a table for the jury to see included a collection of beakers, precursor chemicals, and a notebook filled with frantic handwritten formulas. To the untrained eye, it was the damning paraphernalia of a low-level methamphetamine cook. To Judge Thorne, it was something more. It was a personal affront, a stain on his family name, a walking, breathing symbol of failure that he was now forced to confront from the bench. His gaze fell upon his brother, not with judicial impartiality, but with a cold, familial contempt. "Dr. Hale, you are the prosecution's lead chemical expert. Is that correct?" the prosecutor, a slick young man named Peterson, asked. Dr. Hale, a portly man with a self-satisfied smile and a cheap suit, puffed out his chest. "Chief forensic chemist for the State Police Crime Lab, 25 years of experience." He spoke with the unearned confidence of a man who had not been seriously challenged in a very long time. "And you have analyzed the defendant's notebook, specifically the primary formula detailed on page 17?" Peterson continued, his tone smooth and practiced. "I have," Hale confirmed, picking up a laser pointer. A projection of the notebook page appeared on a large screen behind him. It was a chaotic scrawl of letters, numbers, and molecular diagrams. "It is a variation of the P2P synthesis method. Crude, inefficient, but undeniably a recipe for the production of methamphetamine. The ratios are all there. The process is clearly, if amateurishly, outlined." Judge Thorne leaned forward, his knuckles white as he gripped his gavel. He looked from the projected formula to his brother's impassive face. This was it, the final nail in the coffin of his family's shame. He could feel the eyes of the gallery on him, the whispers he imagined were spreading through the legal community. His brother, a meth cook. The humiliation was a physical burn in his throat. Peterson was about to continue his questioning when a quiet voice cut through the sterile air of the courtroom. It was not loud, but it had a peculiar clarity, a precision that made every other sound in the room, the humming lights, the shuffling feet, the rustle of papers, fall away into absolute silence. "That formula is wrong. Every head swiveled towards Elias. He hadn't moved a muscle. His gaze was fixed on the screen, his expression unchanged. He had spoken the words as a simple statement of fact, as one might observe that the sky is blue or that water is wet. A wave of shocked murmurs rippled through the gallery. The prosecutor froze mid-sentence. Dr. Hale's smug expression faltered, replaced by a flash of indignant confusion. But it was Judge Thorne whose reaction was the most potent. A slow, incredulous smile spread across his lips, a smile devoid of humor and filled with a chilling, condescending cruelty. He let the silence hang for a moment, savoring it, before letting out a short, sharp bark of a laugh that echoed like a gunshot in the cavernous room. "Wrong," the judge boomed, his voice dripping with theatrical disbelief. He leaned into his microphone, his eyes locking onto his brother. "The defendant, a man scraped from the floor of a flophouse, presumes to correct a state-certified expert with 25 years of experience?" He laughed again, a deeper, rolling sound this time, and a few sycophantic titters joined him from the jury box in the gallery. "Pray tell, Mr. Thorne, enlighten us. What, in your vast and drug-addled expertise, is wrong with the formula?" The sarcasm was a physical force, designed to crush and humiliate. But Elias did not shrink. He remained a stone wall of composure. His eyes, clear and focused, shifted from the screen to Dr. Hale, and then finally to his brother on the bench. "The tertiary amen," Elias said, his voice still quiet but unwavering. "It's incorrectly bonded. He's using a phenylacetone precursor, but the catalytic hydrogenation step is written. It's unstable. The pressure and temperature parameters listed on the next page would initiate a runaway exothermic reaction." He paused, his gaze boring into the expert witness. "It's not a formula for methamphetamine. It's a blueprint for a bomb, a very effective one." The room went silent again, but this time it was a different kind of silence. It was heavier, laced with a sudden sharp thread of tension. The judge's smile vanished, replaced by a thunderous scowl. He saw this not as a scientific correction, but as an act of defiance, an attack on the authority of his court. "A bomb," Judge Thorne repeated, his voice cracking like a whip. He pointed a trembling finger at Elias. "You are in a court of law, not a back-alley chemistry club, you pathetic brat. You are accused of a crime, and you will not make a mockery of these proceedings with your delusional fantasies." Dr. Hale, recovering his composure, scoffed loudly. "Your Honor, this is absurd. The man is clearly delirious. The amine bond is standard." "Standard? I've seen this exact synthesis 100 times. It's kitchen chemistry. Unstable, perhaps, but it produces the desired narcotic. His talk of a runaway reaction is pure fiction, a desperate attempt to sow confusion." The judge slammed his gavel down, the crack echoing the snap in his patience. The sound was a declaration of war. "Enough!" he roared, his face flushed a deep mottled red. "I have heard enough of this nonsense. The defendant's outburst is noted and will be considered an aggravating factor at sentencing. We will proceed. The expert has testified. The evidence is clear." He glared at Elias, his eyes promising a world of pain. "You will be silent, or I will have you gagged and bound to that chair. Do you understand me, boy?" The word boy was a deliberate cruelty, a final twist of the knife meant to strip away the last vestiges of dignity. But Elias Thorne simply held his brother's furious gaze, his own eyes filled not with fear or anger, but with a profound, chilling certainty, a deep, sorrowful knowledge of the catastrophe his brother was so arrogantly dismissing. In the silent space between them, a chasm opened, one of knowledge versus ego, of truth versus power. And the judge, blinded by his own hubris, had just chosen to leap headfirst into the abyss. The public humiliation had been swift and brutal, a masterclass in judicial tyranny. Judge Thorne, having silenced his brother, proceeded with the air of a man swatting a fly. He directed the prosecutor to wrap up, his gestures sharp and dismissive. He cut off Elias's public defender, a young, overwhelmed woman named Sarah Jenkins, before she could even formulate a proper objection. The entire proceeding became a performance of his own authority, With Elias as the silent, disgraced property, Sarah Jenkins sat beside Elias, her hands trembling slightly. She was new, idealistic, and utterly out of her depth. She had seen the files, read the police report. On paper, Elias Thorne was a lost cause, another casualty of the opioid crisis who had graduated to cooking his own poison. But she had also seen his eyes when he spoke. There was no desperation in them, no frantic grasping for a lie. There was only the cold, hard light of absolute conviction. She had felt a jolt, a dissonance between the man on paper and the man sitting beside her. "Objection, Your Honor," she had tried, her voice barely a squeak. "My client has raised a substantive challenge to the prosecution's central piece of evidence. We request the opportunity to have an independent expert review the formula." Judge Thorne had looked down at her as if she were a piece of lint on his robe. "Request denied," he'd snapped. "Your client is a meth addict, Miss Jenkins, not a Nobel laureate. He has had his little outburst. Do not waste this court's time with any more of his drug-fueled fantasies. Sit down." The command was so laden with venom that Sarah had physically recoiled, sinking back into her chair. The gallery had watched in stunned silence, a collective intake of breath at the sheer force of the judge's fury. He was no longer a judge. He was a tyrant on a throne, and his courtroom was his kingdom of absolute power. The humiliation was not just for Elias anymore. It was for anyone who dared to question the king. Now, as the jury was being led out to begin their laughably brief deliberations, Judge Thorne leaned back in his chair, a smug, satisfied look returning to his face. He had reasserted control. He had put the dregs of his family in their place. He made a show of looking at his watch, a gold Rolex that gleamed under the harsh lights. He was bored. He was in charge. Elias remained perfectly still, a statue of quiet defiance. But inside, his mind was a storm of precise, terrifying calculations. He saw the formula not as ink on paper, but as a living, breathing thing. He could visualize the molecules, the strained bonds of the tertiary amine. He could feel the kinetic energy building, the heat that Dr. Hale's hubris and his brother's rage were so callously ignoring. He wasn't just predicting a reaction, he was witnessing it in the theater of his mind, a silent internal horror film of pressure gauges spinning into the red, of containment vessels groaning, of a white-hot flash that would vaporize steel and flesh. He remembered his time at Caltech, under the tutelage of the legendary Dr. Alistair Finch. He had been the prodigy, the golden boy of organic chemistry. His name had been on papers that were redefining synthetic pathways. Finch had called him his finest instrument, a mind that could see the music in molecular structures. He remembered the smell of the labs, clean and sharp, the thrill of discovery, the elegant dance of a perfectly balanced equation. And he remembered the fall. It wasn't a slow slide, it was a plummet, a car accident, his wife and daughter gone in an instant of shattered glass and twisted metal. The grief had been a black hole, consuming the light, the passion, the music. The university granted him a leave of absence, but he never went back. He had sought oblivion in the very chemicals he had once mastered, using his genius not to create, but to destroy himself. He had chased the dragon, and it had devoured him whole, leaving behind this hollowed-out shell that now sat in his brother's courtroom. But the knowledge, the core of his genius, had remained. It was a curse, a ghost of the man he had been, and it was screaming at him now, a silent siren of impending doom. Sarah Jenkins watched him. She saw the subtle tension in his jaw, the way his gaze was distant, fixed on something no one else could see. She had clerked for a year, and she knew the look of a guilty man. This wasn't it. This was something else entirely. This was the look of a man watching a train wreck in slow motion, powerless to stop it. The judge's voice boomed again, pulling her from her thoughts. "While we await the jury's foregone conclusion, I am holding the defendant in contempt of court for his disruptive and disrespectful outburst." He pointed his gavel at Elias. "Bail is set at $500,000. A gasp went through the room. It was an impossible punitive sum designed not to ensure an appearance, but to inflict punishment. It was a king's ransom for a man who looked like he didn't have $5 to his name. It was the judge, once again, using his power like a bludgeon. "Your Honor," Sarah exclaimed, jumping to her feet, "that is excessive and unconstitutional." My client has no means. It is what it is, counselor. The judge cut her off coldly. He can contemplate his disrespect from a cell in Rikers. Perhaps a few weeks surrounded by actual criminals will teach him some humility. He then looked directly at Elias, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. Unless you have $500,000 tucked away in that filthy hoodie of yours, boy. The final insult hung in the air. The utter degradation was complete. But in that moment, something shifted in Sarah Jenkins. The fear that had paralyzed her moments before was burned away by a surge of pure, righteous fury. The injustice was too blatant, too grotesque to ignore. She looked at Elias, at his quiet, unbreakable dignity in the face of this onslaught, and she felt a profound sense of shame. Not for him, but for the system she had sworn to uphold. She remembered something from his file, a small, overlooked detail from his intake interview. When asked for an emergency contact, he had given a name. Not a family member, not a friend, but a name and a title. Dr. Alistair Finch, Blackwater Applied Sciences. At the time, she had dismissed it as the rambling of an addict. Blackwater Applied Sciences wasn't a public entity. It was a shadowy, high-level government contractor, a place of myth and whispers in the scientific community. It was a place that did not take calls from public defenders about indigent clients. But now, seeing the look in Elias's eyes, hearing the chilling certainty in his voice, she wondered. It was a crazy, career-ending risk. Making that call would be a breach of protocol, a leap of faith into the professional abyss. But letting this farce continue felt like a greater betrayal. While the judge was occupied giving instructions to the bailiffs, Sarah leaned close to Elias, her voice a low, urgent whisper. "Dr. Finch, is he real? Will he help you?" For the first time, Elias's gaze shifted to her. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and in the depths of his tired eyes she saw a flicker of something ancient and powerful, a mind that had wrestled with the fundamental forces of the universe. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. That was all she needed. It was enough. With a surge of adrenaline that made her heart hammer against her ribs, Sarah turned her back to the judge's bench. She fumbled in her briefcase for her cell phone, her fingers clumsy with haste. She shielded the screen with her body, her back a fragile barrier against the monolithic power of the court. She pulled up the file, found the name, and did a quick, frantic search. A single, unlisted number for the director's office at Blackwater. It was a long shot, a shot in the dark, a prayer. Her thumb hovered over the call button. She took a deep breath, the stale courtroom air tasting of ozone and rebellion. She thought of her law school oaths, of justice, of truth. She looked at the arrogant, preening man on the bench and then at the quiet, broken genius beside her. The choice was clear. She pressed the button. The call connected on the first ring. There was no automated menu, no secretary. Just a crisp male voice that sounded like it was accustomed to immense authority. "Finch," Sarah's own voice was a reedy whisper. "My name is Sarah Jenkins. I'm a public defender in New York. I'm calling on behalf of Elias Thorne." There was a beat of silence on the other end of the line. It was not a silence of confusion, but of sudden, sharp attention. It was the sound of a predator's ears swiveling to pinpoint a sound. "Where is he?" Finch's voice was different now. The casual authority was gone, replaced by a cold, hard urgency that sent a shiver down Sarah's spine. "He's in a courtroom, in Manhattan, 100 Center Street, Part 32. Sarah's voice faltered. How could she explain the situation? The injustice, the formula, the judge who was Elias's own brother? "Put him on," Finch commanded. The words were not a request. "I can't. He's in custody, the judge." "Give me the judge's name," Finch interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Thorne, Judge Marcus Thorne." Another silence, this one colder and more dangerous than the last. Sarah could almost hear the gears turning, the connections being made. When Finch spoke again, his voice was transformed. It was no longer just a voice. It was a weapon. "Miss Jenkins," he said, and the sound was like the chipping of ice. "You have done the right thing. Now, I need you to listen very carefully. Stall. Do whatever you have to do. Object, argue, feign a medical emergency. I don't care. Buy me 45 minutes. Can you do that?" I think so," Sarah stammered, her mind reeling. Good. Help is on the way. The line went dead. Sarah lowered the phone, her hand shaking so badly she almost dropped it. Help is on the way. The words echoed in the sudden roaring silence of her own mind. What had she just done? What kind of help had she just summoned? She looked at Elias, who was now being flanked by two burly bailiffs, ready to haul him away to the holding cells. She had to stall. 45 minutes. It felt like an eternity. She straightened her shoulders, took another deep breath, and turned to face the monolithic power of Judge Marcus Thorne. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach. But now it had a companion, a wild, terrifying spark of hope. The game had changed. The pieces were moving on a board far larger than courtroom 3B, and she, a novice public defender, had just made a move that would check the king. The call ended, and in a sterile, windowless office miles away, Dr. Alistair Finch lowered his phone. His face, usually a placid landscape of academic curiosity, was now a storm front of cold fury. Elias, in a courtroom, being silenced by his own brother, and a flawed formula was at the center of it, a formula he recognized instantly from Sarah's frantic, broken description, the P2P synthesis with an unstable tertiary amine. It wasn't just a flawed recipe, it was a signature, the calling card of a rogue chemist they had been hunting for months, a man known only as Prometheus, who sold weaponized chemical formulas on the dark web. The state police lab had mistaken a time bomb for a meth recipe. Finch's mind worked with the speed and precision of a supercomputer. Elias, with his unparalleled intuitive grasp of molecular stability, would have seen the danger in a nanosecond. He would have seen the inevitable catastrophic endpoint of that equation, and he had been laughed at, dismissed, humiliated. Janet, Finch's voice cut through the quiet of his office, sharp and devoid of pleasantries. His assistant, a woman with eyes that missed nothing, and a security clearance that could access the national debt, appeared at his door instantly. Sir, get me General Wallace at the Pentagon, emergency priority Alpha, now. He was already shrugging on a black coat over his crisp shirt. And get a containment and extraction team ready for immediate deployment, full hazmat protocol. Destination, New York State Police Crime Lab Forensics Division. Tell them to clear a 5-block radius. That is not a request. It is an order. Janet didn't blink. She didn't ask why. She simply nodded, her fingers already flying across a keyboard. Priority Alpha bypassed all switchboards, all secretaries. It was a direct line, a digital scream that parted the waters of bureaucracy. Within 30 seconds, a gruff, powerful voice was on the speakerphone. Alistair, what in God's name is it? General Wallace sounded like he had been pulled out of something important. General, Finch said, his voice tight. We have a Prometheus protocol situation, in civilian hands. The New York State Police have mistaken one of his devices for a drug lab. The silence on the line was absolute. The name Prometheus carried more weight in these circles than a declaration of war. My God, Wallace breathed. Where? The formula is evidence in a trial in Manhattan. Their lab is likely attempting to replicate the synthesis as we speak, to confirm their findings. Their lead chemist testified in court that it was a standard procedure. Finch's voice was laced with ice. He's a fool, and he's about to blow half of his facility off the map. What do you need? The general asked, his voice now all business. I need you to make a call to the presiding judge, Marcus Thorne. He needs to halt proceedings and evacuate that courtroom, and I need air clearance. I'm on my way to him now. My asset is in that room. Asset? Wallace asked, confused. I thought all your people were accounted for. He's been off the grid, Finch said, a flicker of pain in his voice. His name is Elias Thorne. He's the defendant. The irony was so thick it was almost suffocating. The one man on the planet who could have stopped this, the man who had tried to stop it, was the one being silenced and sentenced. Jesus Christ, Wallace muttered. Consider it done. The NYPD commissioner will be calling that judge in 60 seconds. He won't like it, but he'll do it. Your birds are cleared for flight. Go get your man, Alistair. The line cut. Finch was already moving, grabbing a secure hard case from a vault in his wall. Inside was not a weapon, but a laptop and a satellite uplink. Proof, data, the irrefutable truth. As he strode through the corridors of Blackwater, a team of 6 men in sharp, dark suits fell in around him, moving with the silent, fluid efficiency of a wolf pack. They were not scientists. They were operators, tasked with protecting the nation's most valuable intellectual assets. And today, their mission was to retrieve a fallen genius from the clutches of ignorance and ego. The elevator descended to a sub-level garage where a black, unmarked helicopter was already spooling up its rotors, the downdraft whipping at their coats. The mobilization was a symphony of brutal efficiency. No wasted movements, no hesitation. An overwhelming, unstoppable force had been set in motion by a single, whispered phone call. The arrogant authority of Judge Marcus Thorne was about to collide with a power so far beyond his comprehension that it might as well have been alien. The scales of justice, so grotesquely imbalanced in courtroom 3B, were about to be shattered and reforged with lightning and thunder. Back in the courtroom, Sarah Jenkins was fighting the battle of her life. She was a lone soldier holding a narrow pass against an army. She had thrown herself in front of the bailiffs, her arms spread wide. "You can't take him," she had yelled, her voice shaking but loud. "I am filing an immediate emergency appeal on the bail ruling. It's unconstitutional, and you know it, Your Honor." Judge Thorne looked at her with a mixture of fury and amusement. "An appeal? On what grounds, counselor? That your feelings are hurt? On the grounds of the Eighth Amendment. On the grounds that you are using bail as a punitive measure, not a surety. On the grounds that your personal animus toward the defendant is poisoning these entire proceedings." Each word was a gamble, a professional poker chip thrown into the pot. The judge's face darkened. "You are on thin ice, Miss Jenkins. One more word, and I will hold you in contempt right alongside this pathetic excuse for a man." "Then hold me in contempt," she shot back, empowered by the knowledge that the clock was ticking in her favor. "But you will have to go through me to take him. The law is on my side, even if you are not." The sheer audacity of it stunned the courtroom into silence. A public defender, the lowest rung on the courtroom ladder, was openly defying a senior judge. The bailiffs hesitated, looking to the judge for instruction. Marcus Thorne was momentarily speechless, his mouth opening and closing like a fish. He had never, in 20 years on the bench, been challenged with such open rebellion. It was at that precise moment of tense standoff that a clerk hurried into the room, his face pale, and rushed to the bench. He handed the judge a note. Judge Thorne snatched it, annoyed by the interruption. He read the first line, and the color drained from his face. He read the second, and his expression of arrogant fury dissolved into one of slack-jawed disbelief. The note was from the office of the NYPD commissioner himself. It was not a request. It was an order citing a matter of extreme national security. "Under the authority of a directive from the Department of Defense, you are hereby ordered to halt all proceedings. Do not adjourn. Do not recess. Do not let anyone leave courtroom 3B. A federal team is en route. This is a matter of priority alpha." Priority alpha. The judge didn't know the specifics, but he knew what it meant. It was a term whispered in hushed tones, a designation that superseded every other form of authority. It was the hand of God reaching down into his little kingdom. He looked up, his eyes wide and confused. He looked at Sarah Jenkins, then at the bailiffs, and finally, his gaze settled on his brother. Elias was still watching him, his expression unchanged, but now his stillness seemed different. It was no longer the stillness of defeat. It was the stillness of inevitability, the calm at the eye of a hurricane that was about to make landfall directly on top of Judge Marcus Thorne's world. Suddenly, a sharp, piercing alarm began to blare from the bailiff's radio, a frantic, squawking sound that shattered the tense quiet. The bailiff fumbled with the device, his face growing paler by the second. He listened, then looked up at the judge, his eyes wide with horror. "Your Honor! Christ, Your Honor! The State Crime Lab," he stammered. "There's been an explosion, a massive one, the whole forensics wing. It's gone." A collective gasp, a wave of pure shock, washed over the courtroom. The words hung in the air, heavy and terrible. The lab, the forensics wing, where Dr. Hale, the smug, self-assured expert, had likely been attempting to replicate the crude, inefficient formula. The room went silent. Elias closed his eyes, not in surprise, not in triumph. He closed them in sorrow. For the lives lost to hubris, for the catastrophe he had tried and failed to prevent. He had given them the truth, and they had laughed. Now the truth had answered back, not with words, but with fire and fury. Judge Thorne stared, unseeing, at the back wall of his courtroom. His mind, once a fortress of arrogant certainty, was now a ruin. The explosion. The priority alpha directive, his brother's quiet, chilling warning. The pieces were clicking into place, forming a picture of such monumental, terrifying significance that his brain could barely process it. He felt a cold dread creeping up his spine, a primal fear he had not felt since childhood. He had not just been wrong. He had been catastrophically, apocalyptically wrong, and his brother, the man he had mocked and belittled, had been right. It was into this tableau of dawning horror that the thunder arrived. The great oak doors at the back of the courtroom burst open, slamming against the walls with a sound like a controlled demolition. The noise was so violent, so final, that several people in the gallery screamed. All motion ceased. All breathing seemed to stop. Framed in the doorway stood not one man, but 7. In the lead was a man in his late 60s, with a mane of white hair and eyes that burned with a fierce, cold intelligence. It was Dr. Alistair Finch. He wore no uniform, just a simple but exquisitely tailored black coat, yet he radiated an authority that made Judge Thorne's judicial robes look like a cheap costume. Behind him, fanned out in a perfect, intimidating semicircle, were the 6 operators from Blackwater. They were dressed in dark, functional suits, but they moved with the predatory grace of soldiers. Their faces were grim, their eyes scanning the room, assessing every person, every angle, every threat. They were not police. They were something else entirely, something older and more serious. Their very presence changed the atmospheric pressure in the room, making the air thick and heavy with unspoken power. The procession began. They did not rush. They walked down the central aisle with a measured, rhythmic tread, their hard-soled shoes striking the marble floor in perfect, unnerving unison. Thud, thud, thud. It was the sound of an approaching execution. It was the sound of judgment. The entire courtroom, the jury, the gallery, the lawyers, the clerks, was frozen in a state of collective awe and terror. They watched, mouths agape, as this silent, intimidating phalanx advanced. Judge Thorne, from his elevated bench, seemed to shrink. The sheer, overwhelming presence of these men was a force of nature that dwarfed his own carefully constructed authority. He was a king in a cardboard crown, and the true rulers of the world had just walked into his throne room. The procession did not stop at the prosecutor's table. It did not stop at the bar. It continued past them, ignoring them as if they were furniture. Their destination was the defendant's table. Dr. Finch and his men came to a halt directly in front of Elias. The bailiffs who had been flanking him took an involuntary step back, their hands falling away from their sidearms as if they had been burned. Then came the act of respect, an action so profound and so shocking in this context that it seemed to bend reality itself. Dr. Alistair Finch, a man who advised presidents and generals, a titan of science and a shadow power in the government, looked at the gaunt, disheveled man in the threadbare hoodie. His expression of cold fury softened into one of deep, pained respect. He drew himself up to his full height, and he saluted. It was not a casual gesture. It was a sharp, formal, military-style salute, a sign of profound deference from a superior to an honored equal. The 6 operators behind him, as one, snapped to perfect attention, their bodies ramrod straight, their eyes fixed forward. The courtroom held its breath. The image was surreal. Impossible. This group of powerful, dangerous-looking men paying homage to the meth addict, the lost cause, the family shame. Judge Marcus Thorne watched, his world crumbling. The salute was not aimed at him. The respect was not for him. In his own courtroom, at the zenith of his power, he had been rendered utterly and completely irrelevant. They had ignored him. They had bypassed his authority as if it were a cobweb in a doorway. Finch held the salute for a long moment, his eyes locked with Elias's. Then he lowered his hand and spoke, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the silent room. It was not addressed to the judge or the court. It was addressed only to Elias. "Elias," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I'm so sorry. I should have found you sooner." Elias gave a slow, weary nod, the first sign of emotion he had shown all day. A deep, shuddering sigh escaped his lips, the sound of a man who had been carrying an impossible weight for a very long time and had just been allowed to set it down. It was only then, after this profound act of fealty, that Dr. Finch turned his attention to the man on the bench. He turned slowly, deliberately, and his eyes, which had been filled with warmth for Elias, were now chips of Arctic ice. He looked up at Judge Thorne, who sat stunned and speechless, his gavel lying useless on the desk before him. "Judge Marcus Thorne," Finch began, and his voice was no longer quiet. It was a formal, declamatory pronouncement, each word a hammer blow of condemnation. "My name is Dr. Alistair Finch. I am the director of the Blackwater Applied Sciences Group, under contract with the Department of Defense, and for the last 2 hours I have been listening to a recording of this travesty." He gestured to the whole room, a sweep of his hand that dismissed the entire proceeding. "You have, through a combination of staggering arrogance and willful ignorance, committed an act of such profound negligence that it borders on treason. The man you have spent the day mocking, humiliating, and attempting to imprison," Finch pointed directly at Elias, "is Elias Thorne, the single most brilliant synthetic chemist of his generation, the man whose work on catalytic hydrogenation quite literally wrote the book that your so-called expert clearly failed to read." A tremor went through the judge. His face, which had been pale, was now turning a pasty, sickly white. He looked like he was going to be sick. "The formula you dismissed as kitchen chemistry," Finch continued, his voice rising in volume and intensity, "was a weaponized chemical device created by a techno-terrorist we have been hunting for 6 months. It was a bomb, just as Elias told you, a bomb that your state crime lab, in their infinite wisdom, decided to assemble. As of 12 minutes ago, the entire west wing of their facility no longer exists. Early reports suggest at least a dozen casualties, including your star witness, Dr. Hale." The finality of it, the confirmation of the catastrophe, hit the room like a physical blow. The jurors looked at each other, their faces masks of horror. The prosecutor, Peterson, had sunk into his chair, his slick confidence gone, replaced by the dawning terror of his own complicity. "You had the one man in the world who could see the danger, sitting right here in your courtroom," Finch roared, his voice now a thunderclap of righteous fury that shook the very windows. "He tried to warn you. He gave you the truth, clear and simple. And what did you do? You laughed, you called him a brat, you threatened him. You used the authority of that robe not to seek justice, but to nurse your pathetic, bruised ego and crush a man who was already broken." Finch took a step closer to the bench, his eyes burning into the judge's. "You are not a judge. You are a disgrace. You are a petty tyrant who has mistaken his bench for a throne, and you have allowed your vanity to cost people their lives." He turned to one of his operators. "Secure him." The operator moved with terrifying speed. He mounted the steps to the bench, his movements fluid and precise. Judge Thorne, paralyzed by shock, could only watch as the man reached him. The operator did not touch the judge. Instead, he reached down and picked up the gavel. He held it for a moment. Then, with a look of utter contempt, he snapped the wooden handle over his knee. The crack was sharp, final, the sound of a career, a reputation, and a lifetime of arrogance breaking in two. Then, the operator looked at the judge, who had shrunken into his high-backed chair, a small, pathetic man lost in the folds of his black robe. "You are relieved, sir," the operator said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. He then gestured to 2 uniformed court officers who had been standing by, paralyzed. "Escort this man to his chambers. He is not to leave. He is to have no communication with anyone. He is now the subject of a federal investigation." Judge Marcus Thorne was finished. He had been publicly stripped of his power, his credibility, and his dignity in the most dramatic and complete way imaginable. His face was a canvas of ruin, his eyes hollow with the magnitude of his fall. He was no longer a figure of authority. He was just a man, exposed and broken, who was about to face the consequences of his monumental failure. The king had been dethroned. The court was in chaos, and at the center of it all, Elias Thorne was finally devastatingly vindicated. The immediate aftermath was a whirlwind of controlled chaos. As Judge Thorne was led away, a broken man shuffling in his own robes of shame, the courtroom erupted into a cacophony of frantic whispers and panicked movements. The jury was hastily dismissed, their faces a mixture of shock and dawning comprehension. The prosecutor, Peterson, sat as if turned to stone, staring at the now empty judge's bench, the architect of his own impending professional ruin. Dr. Finch moved back to Elias's side, his operators forming a protective cordon around them, a human wall that separated them from the pandemonium. He placed a gentle hand on Elias's shoulder. "It's over, son. We're getting you out of here." But Elias didn't move. He looked at the chaos, at the fear and confusion on the faces of the people in the gallery. Then his gaze drifted to the now vacant bench where his brother had sat in judgment. There was no triumph in his eyes, no satisfaction, only a vast, cavernous sadness. Sarah Jenkins, who had been watching the entire spectacle with a mixture of terror and elation, approached the circle of men. "Dr. Finch? The charges? What happens to the charges against him?" Finch turned to her, and his icy demeanor softened slightly. "Miss Jenkins," he said, his voice now calm and measured, "there are no charges. There never were. The evidence was inadmissible, the expert witness was fatally incompetent, and the presiding judge has just demonstrated himself to be criminally negligent. This entire case is being expunged from the record as if it never happened." He gave her a small, genuine smile. "You showed remarkable courage today. Elias is lucky to have had you in his corner." Sarah felt a blush rise to her cheeks, a wave of relief so profound it almost made her dizzy. She looked at Elias, who finally turned his gaze towards her. He gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod of gratitude that meant more to her than any words. "Come on, Elias," Finch said gently, guiding him towards the aisle. "Let's go home." As the group began to move, they passed the prosecutor's table. Peterson looked up, his face ashen. He opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to apologize, perhaps to beg, but Finch cut him off with a single, withering glare. "You have a choice, son," Finch said, his voice low and dangerous. "You can resign quietly and find a new profession, or you can face a federal inquiry for your role in this fiasco. I suggest you choose wisely." Peterson visibly flinched and shrank back into his chair, speechless. They escorted Elias out of the courtroom, not through the public doors, but through the judge's private corridor, a path of power now used to spirit away its victim. As they walked down the marble hallway, away from the noise and the wreckage of his brother's career, Elias finally spoke, his voice hoarse from disuse. "The others in the lab," he murmured. "Did they all?" Finch's face tightened. "We don't know yet. The evacuation order went out, but we don't know if it was in time for everyone. They were playing with a fire they didn't understand." He paused, then looked at Elias, his expression one of profound regret. "You tried to tell them. You did all you could." Elias said nothing, but the weight of the avoidable tragedy settled on his shoulders. This was no victory. It was a grim testament to the destructive power of pride. They left the courthouse and stepped into the cool afternoon air, where a fleet of black government-plated SUVs waited, their engines humming. The world outside was oblivious, the sounds of city traffic a stark contrast to the drama that had just unfolded. Elias was gently guided into the back of the lead vehicle. As the door closed, he was enveloped in a quiet, leather-scented darkness, a sanctuary from the harsh glare of the world that had judged him so wrongly. His public vindication was complete, but the quiet personal cost was only just beginning to be counted. Months melted into a season, and the fallout from the events in courtroom 3B settled over the city's legal and scientific communities like a thick layer of ash. The consequences for the arrogant were as severe as they were inevitable. Judge Marcus Thorne was not merely disbarred, he was utterly destroyed. A judicial review board, spurred by a scathing report from the Department of Defense, found him guilty of gross negligence, abuse of power, and a pattern of conduct that brought the entire judiciary into disrepute. He faced federal charges for obstruction and endangerment, and in a plea deal to avoid a lengthy prison sentence, he accepted a lifetime ban from practicing law in any capacity, along with a humiliating public censure. His name became a cautionary tale, a synonym for judicial hubris. His wife left him. His friends abandoned him. He sold his opulent home to pay his legal fees and moved into a small, anonymous apartment, a king exiled to a peasant's hovel. The systemic changes were swift and sweeping. The explosion at the state crime lab, which ultimately claimed 15 lives, led to a complete overhaul of forensic protocols. The Thorne-Finch Protocol was instituted statewide, a mandatory cross-verification system for all high-stakes chemical evidence, requiring independent confirmation from a federally approved list of experts before it could be presented in court. Dr. Alastair Finch himself oversaw the creation of the new training programs, ensuring that the lesson written in Blood and Fire would never be forgotten. Sarah Jenkins, once an unknown public defender, was hailed as a hero. She was offered a position at a prestigious civil rights firm, her act of defiance a beacon for young, idealistic lawyers everywhere. Elias Thorne, however, vanished. He did not seek the spotlight. He did not grant interviews. He was taken back into the quiet, high-security fold of Blackwater Applied Sciences. There, under Finch's care, he slowly began to heal. He was given a lab, state-of-the-art and silent, a sanctuary where he could once again speak the language of molecules. The work was his therapy. He designed new stable compounds for medical use, untangled complex environmental toxins, and quietly contributed more to human progress in 6 months than most scientists do in a lifetime. The fire in his mind, once turned inward for self-destruction, was now aimed outward again, burning with a clean, creative flame. He remained a quiet, humble hero, a ghost in the machine of progress, his honor restored not by public acclaim, but by the quiet dignity of his work. One crisp autumn evening, nearly a year after the trial, Elias was leaving his lab when he saw a figure waiting for him by the gate. The man was thinner, his expensive suit now ill-fitting, his silver hair no longer perfectly coiffed. It was Marcus. The two brothers stood in silence for a long moment, the chasm between them filled with the wreckage of their shared history. Marcus looked older, his face etched with lines of shame and regret. The arrogance was gone, burned away by the fires of his own making. "Elias," Marcus began, his voice raspy, unfamiliar. I needed to see you." Elias waited, his expression unreadable. He offered no comfort, no easy absolution. "I'm sorry," Marcus said, the words sounding like they were being torn from his throat. "That's not enough. I know it's not. What I did, the way I treated you, it was monstrous. I was so blinded by my own reflection, by what I thought your life said about me. I never saw you. I just saw my own failure." He looked down at his hands, then back up at his brother, his eyes pleading. "I lost everything, my career, my wife, my name, and I deserved it. I deserved all of it. I need to know. Can you ever forgive me?" Elias listened, his calm unwavering. He thought of the 15 people who died. He thought of the years he had lost in a haze of grief and self-destruction. He thought of the man his brother had been, and the broken shell that stood before him now. "Forgiveness isn't the point, Marcus," Elias said finally, his voice quiet but firm. "My forgiveness won't unbreak the lives that were shattered. It won't restore your honor." He took a step closer, his gaze intense. "What matters is what you do now. You were a judge. You were supposed to be a guardian of justice. You failed. The question isn't whether I forgive you. It's whether you can find a way to serve the justice you so profoundly betrayed." Marcus stared at him, confused. "How? I have nothing. I am nothing." "That's not true," Elias replied. "You have your knowledge, you have your shame, and you have your life. Go work at a legal aid clinic, for free. Use your experience to help the kinds of people you used to look down on. The poor, the addicted, the ones the system chews up. Don't do it for forgiveness. Do it because it's the right thing to do. Do it until the work itself is your only reward." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "Maybe then, one day you'll be able to forgive yourself. And that's the only forgiveness that will ever truly matter. With that, Elias turned and walked away, leaving his brother standing alone in the twilight. He did not look back. He was not a judge. He was a scientist. His path was not one of absolution, but of creation. He had a world to mend, one molecule at a time, and he was leaving the ghosts of the past behind to find their own redemption.